Chapter 2. What the Activists Say. In March 2017, I debated a board member for Equality Texas on the subject of school policies on gender identity. The debate was sponsored by the Federalist Society chapter at the University of Texas at Austin School of Law. UT Austin isn't exactly a bastion of conservatism, but I had spoken there before and always without incident. The room was packed, and it was colorful, lots of pink and rainbows. But what I remember most about the debate was that several protesters interrupted and started chanting over a megaphone, "Trans lives are not a debate. F this guy and F this state." The protesters were right about one thing: trans lives are not a debate. The topic at issue that day was not whether people who identify as transgender have a right to their lives, it was what sort of public policies best respect the lives of students who identify as transgender and the lives of all other students. Activists have a rather radical idea of what is required in terms of public policy to respect trans lives, and Texas wasn't going along with that agenda. A bill had recently been introduced in the State House of Representatives to allow reasonable accommodations for people who identify as transgender but not give unfettered access to the bathrooms, locker rooms, and showers of their choice. Activists found that outrageous. While the colorful language of the protesters left the most vivid memory, something else about that debate has stuck with me. My opponent, a lawyer and LGBT activist, opened his remarks with a simple statement of what guided his thinking on these policy questions. A transgender boy is a boy and thus should be treated like all other boys. A transgender girl is a girl and thus should be treated like all other girls. This statement conveys a radical idea, and it reflects a shift of thinking among activists in recent years. No longer do they admit that a transgender boy is a biological girl who identifies as a boy, or that a transgender girl is a biological boy who identifies as a girl. Now they assert that people actually are the sex they claim to be. This change in thinking is illustrated in the language favored by the Human Rights Campaign. When the organization published Transgender Americans, a handbook for understanding in 2005, it defined gender dysphoria as a person's discomfort from the strong internal sense that their true gender identity does not match their physical sex. The handbook noted without quibble that gender dysphoria remains listed as a mental disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That was then. Now the HRC website gives this advice, with bolding and italics, to journalists for reporting about transgender people: refrain from contrasting trans men and women with real or biological men and women. Contrasting transgender people with real or biological men and women is a false comparison. They are real men and women, and doing so contributes to the inaccurate perception that transgender people are being deceptive when, in fact, they are being authentic and courageous. This is a dramatic shift. From an emphasis on transgender identity being at odds with physical sex to the idea of gender identity being essentially the determinant of sex, from acknowledging gender dysphoria as a mental disorder to regarding transgender identities as just a variety of normal human development. These radical beliefs give rise to some equally radical demands. This chapter presents the claims and demands of transgender activists in their own words, what they assert to be the truth about gender identity, and what they seek in terms of medical treatment and public policy. Special attention is focused on what they say about children, the demands made on our nation's schools, and the efforts to bypass parental authority. For the most part, this chapter simply reports what activists say, avoiding extended engagement with their arguments, but noting some of the more outrageous and inaccurate statements along the way. In subsequent chapters we will assess these claims in more detail. It is easy to get things wrong. Getting them right takes hard work. 3 realities about transgender activists will become clear. First, they are always changing their creed and expanding their demands. Yesterday's mandatory vocabulary will become tomorrow's epithets. Yesterday's enlightenment will be tomorrow's benighted bigotry. Yesterday's requirements of science and medicine and justice are tomorrow's suicide-inducing oppression. Second, even as their own position shifts, the activists are absolutely closed off to contrary evidence. They call for the censure of honest researchers. They refuse to give any consideration to competing interests of privacy or safety. They reject alternative therapies that may be favored by parents or doctors. Third, because the transgender movement is so close-minded, it inclines toward coercion. All of this suggests a posture of defensiveness that activists know their claims can't stand up to scrutiny.